I'm Kylie, just another Army vet, and today I'm reacting to a video from Real Time History. This is Forgotten Armies of the Vietnam War, Australia, Korea, China, USSR. This is supposed to be a great video, very eye-opening, so let's get to it.
The Vietnam War is often seen as an entirely American intervention in a foreign land, and Vietnamese still refer to the 1965 to 1973 period as the American War. American historians and popular culture mostly focus on U.S. involvement in the war, but thousands of troops from other countries also fought and died on both sides. When the U.S. enters the Vietnam War in 1965, President Lyndon Johnson hopes an international coalition will join him. Not only will this provide military resources, but also legitimize U.S. actions, both internationally and domestically. He calls on members of SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, a kind of Pacific version of NATO. South Vietnam, like the other former French Indochinese colonies, is barred from joining military alliances, but SEATO claims responsibility for the region anyway. However, few of SEATO's actual members are interested in joining the US. France, having recently withdrawn from the region, has no interest in returning, while Britain claims it cannot intervene as co-chair of the 1954 Geneva Conference, which established North and South Vietnam.
That conference did more than just separate Vietnam. It also ended the First Indochina War, as well as it gave independence to Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, which was all considered to be French Indochina. And I don't blame France for wanting to stay out of that area. They had initially colonized French Indochina in the late 1800s, and then from 1946 to 1954, they were actually fighting Ho Chi Minh and the Communists in the First Indochina War, so France was done.
But the real reasons are that the British public and governments are more concerned about security in Malaya than in Vietnam. So President Johnson's so-called Many Flags campaign does not rally many flags. However, the Philippines and Thailand do send troops for a price. The US grants the Philippines $80 million in aid and agrees to cover the deployment costs for a 2,300-strong engineering and civic support group. Thailand also receives additional aid, as well as deployment costs for sending the Queen's Cobras, a force of 2,000 troops that grows into a 12,000-strong division. Thailand also allows U.S. air bases in the country. Although Filipino and Thai contributions are modest and potentially driven by economic opportunism, some U.S. allies strongly support intervention.
Australia.
In Australia, Prime Minister Robert Menzies sees threats from both Indonesia and China. He hopes Australian support for US-Vietnam policy will encourage the US to commit to Pacific and Australian security. Menzies' forward defense policy sends Australian advisors to South Vietnam in 1962 and introduces national service in 1964.
National service, I'm assuming, is what they're calling the lottery or the draft. And the United States had almost an identical system as well, but I'm not sure what year that actually began.
U.S. ground forces enter South Vietnam in March 1965. Australians soon follow. Initially, a single Australian battalion joins the U.S. 173rd Airborne Brigade, but cooperation is difficult. Australian equipment, some of it dating back to World War II, is lacking compared to the Americans, but there are other differences. Australian troops, many with jungle experience, prefer small unit actions rather than U.S. operations which favor large-scale deployment and massive force. Australian doctrine often could not rely on available fire support, so Australian units expect to be more self-sufficient and flexible. One US officer is impressed. Aussies used squads to make contact and brought in reinforcing elements to do the killing. They planned in the belief that a platoon on the battlefield could do anything, including get out. I still maintain the Australians understood the war better than our guys ever would. Eventually, the Australian presence grows into a separate Australian task force with air support and a small number of New Zealand artillery. Operating in Phuoc Thai province, they rely on methodical patrols, village pacification, and ambushes rather than US-style search and destroy.
Long
On
Tan.
August 18, 1966, one such patrol encounters a force of 2,000 Viet Cong in a rubber plantation at Long Tan. The VC kills several Australians in the opening moments and move to surround the lightly equipped Australian units. But D Company's 6th Battalion holds off VC assaults with the aid of artillery, while Royal Australian Air Force Hueys drop ammunition and medical supplies. As torrential monsoon rain falls, armored personnel carriers and reinforcements fight through the Viet Cong to relieve D Company.
It was 20-1, so a little over 100 of the ANZACS, mostly Australians, versus 2,500 of the Viet Cong and NVA. This was one of the most decisive and brutal battles in all of ANZAC history. But the significance of this battle is the Viet Cong, NVA, they were never able to actually get a foothold in that province after this battle. This is the last time the Viet Cong actually attacked Australia head on. And he did mention something about the artillery and the troop carriers. Well, the 7 troop carriers, I think, that came at the end of the battle, whereas the artillery, that is what probably saved that platoon or that company. That platoon of soldiers was so overwhelmed that they actually were calling in fire within a 50 to 100 yards of their position. That's how confident they were of the gun crews, which I think were Kiwis.
I remember the deafening noise from small arms and artillery, the torrential rain making positive identification of friend or foe extremely hard, my movement forward to 10th Platoon with the radio, and when all seemed lost as the enemy assembled for a final assault, which I firmly believe would have been very difficult for us to repulse, the arrival of our APCs, the relief and joy that flooded us. The Viet Cong withdraw and Australian follow-up operations eliminate large VC units from the province, although the wider VC infrastructure remains in place. Australian jungle and pacification experience from Malaya and Indonesia and their different tactics are responsible for the partial success. Unlike US bases, which employ many Vietnamese civilians and include ARVN personnel, the Australian Task Force base is closed to Vietnamese. As a result, VC informants among workers and ARVN troops cannot accurately estimate Australian strength or predict operations.
The United States did the same thing in Afghanistan and Iraq. I worked at a hospital FOB in Baghdad, and we had hundreds of civilians on the FOB actually as a workforce.
According to one statistic, VC units instigate around 3/4 of combat against US troops, but fire first in just 6.7% of encounters with Australian troops. 2/3 of one battalion's contacts resulted from their own ambushes of the VC. All told, 60,000 Australians serve in Vietnam. But the second largest foreign contribution to South Vietnam's defense doesn't come from a SEATO member. South Korea sends 320,000 troops to Vietnam, with force levels peaking at 50,000 in 1969. The contribution is presented as thanks for US intervention in the Korean War, although South Korea also gains extensive US economic and military aid. The US modernizes the South Korean military, contributes to social welfare, and arranges deals with US companies. President Johnson insists the deal is not rewards for mercenaries, but promotes long-term South Korean security. Some historians suggest the agreement kickstarts South Korea as a major world economy. South Korean troops in Vietnam gain a reputation for aggression and brutality, perhaps due to strict disciplinarian officers or personal animosity towards communism. Whatever the source, it finds a use in Vietnam. Often fighting alongside US forces, Korean soldiers are sometimes given dangerous roles, like infiltrating VC tunnels, or they're turned on suspected enemy villages.
I had no idea. I thought the tunnel rats were mostly the Americans and the ANZACS, but interesting.
In one raid, a US lieutenant recalls, "Whatever else the Koreans did in the village was their own business. But with their reputation for brutality, we all knew that the village would be loath to support the Viet Cong so openly in the future. If we got our kills, we could take full credit, and if the ROKs became overzealous, we could plead our lack of control over our allies."
Whoa.
As the US withdraws from 1969 on, their allies do the same. In the later war years, Allied troops experienced many of the same frustrations as US soldiers, especially an inability to fundamentally destroy the enemy and a poor relationship with the ARVN. Modest but growing protests in both Australia and South Korea also encourage withdrawal. By 1973, all Allies are out of Vietnam. US Allies' losses are 4,400 South Koreans, 512 Australians, 351 Thai, 37 New Zealanders, and 9 Filipinos killed.
For comparison's sake, the United States from 1964 to 1973 had about 2.5 million service members deployed to Vietnam, with over 300,000 wounded and over 58,000 killed.
SEATO itself becomes a casualty as it's disbanded in 1977. The US doesn't only look for allies abroad. Within Vietnam itself, especially in its border and mountainous areas, are ethnic minorities willing to fight. One of the best-known groups are the Montagnards, an umbrella term for many different highland ethnic groups. From 1961, US Special Forces recruit Montagnards into Civilian Irregular Defense Groups, or CIDGs. Australian advisors working within the US 5th Special Forces Group also provide training. Montagnards are often Christian and have their own ethnic identities, which makes them suspicious to both the North and South Vietnamese governments. Even so, US Special Forces recognize them as capable, competent, and self-reliant fighters, as an American officer reports. To my surprise, I discovered that the CIDG troops are not the band of unskilled, disorganized, and disgruntled peasants I had envisioned. They are, in fact, closely knit religious or ethnic minority groups with a fierce loyalty to each other and to those who will treat them with respect and consideration. Initially, the CIDGs provide local defense, but US Special Forces extend their role to mobile unconventional forces. Small teams of US and Vietnamese Special Forces work beside groups of Montagnards to conduct patrols and ambushes. Montagnards use their local knowledge as scouts, interpreters, and interrogators to provide intelligence and proactively hunt the VC. Their methods evolve throughout the conflict, including building Special Forces camps for operations in enemy territory. These so-called fighting camps are designed to be functional, cheap, and quick to build. By using local materials and labor, each costs only about $10,000. They also need to be easily defendable by small garrisons of CIDGs and Special Forces, and to use principles of defense in depth with multiple layers of barbed wire, mines, trip flares, machine guns, mortars, and earthen ramparts and bunkers. But fighting camps are not merely fortresses in enemy territory. They're used for proactive operations, including setting up ambushes.
I wonder if these guys were a part of or worked with the MACV SOG guys. If you know, please drop it in the comments.
During my tour in Vietnam, I've seen a steady improvement in the fighting spirit and military proficiency of the CIDG. The most notable example of this occurred on 8th April 1967. 3 platoons from Camp Trong Dong, without US or Vietnamese Special Forces present, were deployed south and east of the camp in a night ambush position, when an NVA company attacked a regional forces outpost. The CIDG platoons moved to cut off the enemy withdrawal, killing 42 NVA and capturing 20 weapons. By late 1967, Special Forces and Montagnard camps spread across South Vietnam, especially in areas of high enemy activity. Included in this are camps on stilts built along the Mekong River, complete with floating landing pads. Such camps provide CIDGs a degree of operational flexibility impossible with conventional troops, including airborne, riverborne, and nighttime operations. In many cases, CIDG forces locate and pin the enemy while conventional forces rush to the location. In some areas, CIDGs and Special Forces provide 50% of MACV's ground intelligence. And as small, secretive units, they can be used in cross-border incursions into neutral Cambodia and Laos without major political ramifications. Relations between US Green Berets and Montagnards are good, especially since the Special Forces live beside their allies and learn from as well as instruct them. But there were also failures. Relations with South Vietnamese regular troops are poor, even resulting in a Montagnard uprising in 1964. Some commanders fail to fully understand or utilize unconventional forces, either seeing them as simply a strategic reserve or splitting up tightly knit groups. Even so, the lessons learned in Vietnam would go on to influence modern Special Forces operations. It isn't just the US and South Vietnamese who benefit from alliances. In fact, North Vietnam arguably gains the most from foreign aid and cooperation. Since the 1950s, the Soviet Union and China send military aid to Ho Chi Minh's forces. The amount of aid fluctuates over time, as does the main contributor. At first, China provides the most arms, while the Soviet Union urges caution. Once the US intervenes, though, the Soviet Union increases support, including military advisors.
The United States was already involved because they sent financial assistance to the French during the First Indochina War.
There are other factors at play as well. Both China and the Soviet Union want to position themselves as the leading communist supporter of revolutionary movements, a competition made more intense by the growing Sino-Soviet ideological split. But non-ideological strategic concerns might be more important. China sees Vietnam as an important buffer and economic zone, while US preoccupation with Vietnam gives the Soviet Union a freer hand in Europe. Some historians argue China provides quantity aid and the Soviet Union quality. Between 1956 and 1975, China gives economic grants and moves huge amounts of small arms, artillery, and vehicles into North Vietnam. It also sends around 320,000 Chinese engineering and anti-aircraft troops to the north, where they operate weapons and maintain communication and transport lines. This frees up significant manpower for the North Vietnamese regular army. But Chinese supplies fluctuate throughout the years, reflecting growing tension within the communist camp. In 1964, the Soviet Union becomes a more reliable partner. They send KGB and GRU agents to establish communications and intelligence, although the most important contribution is air defense, including modern surface-to-air missiles and MiG-21 fighters. US Air Force pilots, some of them veterans of the Korean War, noticed the improvements in the North Vietnamese anti-air capabilities.
Last year, they had plenty of AAA and some SAMs, but yet this year they've at least their defenses are considerably heavier this year than they were last year, and the SAM threat has increased significantly. The MiGs are considerably more active this year than they were last year.
And the USSR also benefits from this agreement. Air defense forms a central part of their Cold War nuclear strategy, and Vietnam provides an ideal test environment for their weapon systems. Captured and crashed US equipment is sent to Moscow for analysis, while Soviet intelligence provides technical questions for POW interrogation. Some American POWs also report the presence of Soviet officers. On some rare occasions, Soviet troops participate in combat as anti-aircraft units, though in most cases they train and direct North Vietnamese troops.
Why do we not learn about this part of history? This is all new to me. I knew just from past videos and commenters that China and the ANZACS had participated in this war, but I had no idea about the Philippines or South Korea or the USSR.
We turned out to be not bad teachers. In total, our regiment had fired 43 missiles and downed 23 planes. When a shot-down US pilot was told the crews were Vietnamese, he did not believe it. He said that the job smelled Russian. There are claims that Soviet pilots on training flights with North Vietnamese students dogfight US aircraft, but this area is understudied and most evidence is anecdotal. North Korea, though, does send around 200 pilots to support the North Vietnamese Air Force. Other socialist nations also provide support. Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and Bulgaria send economic and military supplies, while Communist Cuba also dispatches advisors. Some US prisoners later claim Cubans work as prison guards and interrogators. Despite public announcements about international communist cooperation, relations between North Vietnam and its allies are mixed. Hanoi complains about unilateral Soviet intelligence gathering in Vietnam, while Chinese relations, already tense due to historical animosity, suffer towards the end of the conflict, especially after President Nixon's 1972 visit to Beijing. The imperialists pursue a policy of détente with some big countries to have a free hand to bully the small countries and stamp out the national liberation movement. China shrinking from its lofty international duties not only is detrimental to revolutionary movements in the world, but will also bring unfathomable harm to itself in the end. Chinese military and economic aid to Vietnam ends abruptly in 1975 after the fall of Saigon. Long-term, this pushes the new Socialist Republic of Vietnam closer to the Soviet Union and further weakens relations with China. Vietnamese nationalism, Chinese economic decline, and support for the genocidal regime of Cambodian leader Pol Pot eventually leads to fresh conflict between China and Vietnam, turning a former friend into Vietnam's most dangerous foe.
This is why Vietnam wanted to actually acquire the BrahMos missile.
The Vietnam War is perhaps the most well-known hot proxy war during the Cold War, when the global superpowers were not battling directly out of fear of nuclear retaliation. And while the nuclear arsenals expanded, the Soviet Union also pursued their vision of nuclear-powered communism by rapidly increasing the production of nuclear reactors. Whole cities were built to accommodate a new atomic elite that would help produce limitless energy. I bet you know the name of one of these cities, Pripyat. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real Time History, the only history channel that is not the band of unskilled, disorganized, and disgruntled peasants that you had envisioned.
In the United States, if you took a college or university class on the Vietnam War, I'm sure it would go into details all about the ANZACS forces, USSR, China, etc. But for most Americans, this is something that we are not taught. How about you guys? What country are you from? And did you guys know about all these other nations that fought in this war? If you do want to watch a video all about the Battle of Long Tan, here you go. Thanks for watching.